So basically, there's a group. There's a kind of a loose confederation, really, of armed militia men and women, probably, but probably mostly men. Maybe a few NBs in there. I'm not going to judge. I don't want to generalize, but I'm also going to generalize. Mostly men, who are white and kind of middle class, who have a lot of time on their hands. And with this time, they spend a lot of time thinking about, what else would they think about, of course, besides the oncoming race war? And you might be saying to yourself, but Jack, I don't think that there is an oncoming race war. That sounds insane. What would that even mean? Well, friends, a race war is basically just when a war breaks out or uncertain times break out, and the theory going that when these stressful times happen on a large scale, of course everyone's just going to gravitate towards their own race category, which A, is historically not what happens, and B, is just kind of an insane thing to think, and it's fueled by white supremacy, which isn't surprising because a lot of these militiamen identify themselves as Boogaloo Boys. And if you're not really familiar with what a Boogaloo Boy is, all you really need to know is that the term Boogaloo Boy, or Boogaloo itself, just originates on 4chan, and was basically used in conjunction with, like, talking about a coming race war, a hypothetical coming race war. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wow, this all sounds really insane and fringe, and why should I care about this? Well, a little organization, you might have heard of it, called the FBI, just yesterday, during the presidential debates, released a report saying that, in fact, the coming race war is projected by these right-wing militia types to be coming imminently, as in the time before the first debate, or in the time between the first debate and the election. In fact, their report describes it as a flashpoint of all of their concerns. Now, if you haven't been paying attention to what the FBI has been saying about, like, white supremacists, or really, like, their whole shtick, right? If you haven't been paying attention to that, you might be going, "Wow, this seems to be coming out of nowhere." But no, in fact, for a very long time now, the FBI has been repeatedly and quietly saying that one of the greatest threats to the United States of America is not from foreign terrorists that we constantly fearmonger about. Instead, it comes from white supremacists that live in the United States and who are expectantly awaiting a race war. Now, you might be going, okay, well, what does that have to do with this particular election cycle? And while it's true that often during elections, and particularly like contentious elections, for example, like when Obama was going through his 2 election cycles, there was a lot of, like, fear-mongering among these far-right types about, like, a race war over the fact that we now have a black president, and, being super racistly charged about that, of course. However, in this particular election cycle, I don't know if any of you have been paying attention to what Trump has been saying, but it falls into the category of dog whistles. And a dog whistle is basically where you say something that sounds innocuous to most people, but to people in the know, they understand what you're actually saying. So, for example, when Trump is saying, oh, we're going to get rid of low-income housing in the suburbs so that we save them, you need to understand that the suburbs were specifically created by white people to protect themselves from having to live near black people in low-income areas. And because white people, on average, have families that are, like, 40 times more wealthy than black families, turns out that the suburbs are largely still segregated by income, with the exception of low-income housing. So when Trump is saying we have to protect the suburbs from low-income housing, what he is in effect saying to these far-right extremist groups is that we have to protect them from black people, brown people, indigenous people, people who might otherwise be economically disadvantaged in this country, proportionally, or disproportionately, I should say. So it's pretty wild here that the FBI didn't want to really make a huge fuss about this. They released it at the same time as the debate. And the same debate, Trump is saying, we can quote him as saying, stand back and stand by, specifically talking to white supremacist groups and these far-right militias, specifically being mentioned in this debate, the Boogaloo Boys. So he told them that, which, while some people might be able to misinterpret that as being like, okay, he told them to stand down, they are all taking that and running with it. They are basically taking his statement as a tacit admission that what they are doing is right and what they are doing is justified and that they should keep doing it. And in fact, Trump followed up that statement by talking about someone has to do something about Antifa, which is basically the politician's equivalent of like, wow, I advocate violence in Minecraft, like that's basically the politician equivalent right there. So basically, and then later in the debate, Trump went on to discredit mail-in voting and called for poll watchers, which I don't know if you guys know like the history of poll watching, but basically it was a thing invented by the KKK to disenfranchise black voters by intimidating them, because you would have a bunch of KKK members at polling places threatening to lynch you if you showed up and you were black. So that in itself has a long history of being associated with that. There are actually poll workers who are overseeing the security of individual polling stations. That is a thing. However, that requires training. And what Trump is advocating is not getting the proper training. He's advocating to his supporters to show up and basically become these vigilante forces at the polling stations to discourage, in his words, to keep it safe. In the real world equivalent, if there are a bunch of armed men, armed, unknown, strange men surrounding a polling place, chances are you're not going to want to show up. I mean, if you're smart, you're not going to want to show up. So it's a whole mess of things. But basically, Ken Klippenstein obtained this internal document, and it says, Boogaloo adherents likely increasing anti-government violent rhetoric and activities, increasing domestic violent extremist threat in the FBI Dallas area of responsibility. And just to clarify, the FBI has a base of operations in Dallas, so it's not saying specifically in Dallas. It's talking about in the entire United States. So let's see. The document states, FBI Dallas field office judges in the next 3 months, continuing up to the January 2021 inauguration, with the presidential elections acting as a potential flashpoint, Boogaloo adherents will likely will expand influence within the FBI Dallas AOR area of responsibility due to the presence of existing anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists, the sentiment of perceived government overreach, heightened tensions due to COVID-19 related state and local restrictions, and or criminal activity at lawful protests as a result of the death of an African-American PER, U.S. person in Minneapolis. Factors that led to violence at otherwise peaceful and lawful protests in the FBI Dallas area of operations. So, what this document is alleging is that essentially there are a number of contributing factors that are kind of radicalizing people to this far-right ideology. And, like, one of those factors being the way COVID-19 has been treated by our government. And not necessarily that our government has really gone overboard, but the fact that there are numerous different voices in our government saying different things, discrediting one another. There's no united front like there was with like H1N1, for example, or Ebola. In fact, part of why people are upset about COVID-19 is because a lot of them don't think it's real, because the president literally said it was a hoax. Like, there are all kinds of different, like, reasonings. Like, some people have lost businesses, some people have lost income, and so they're angry about that, and they're looking for a scapegoat, and their scapegoat is, well, the government screwed us over, but Trump is one of the good ones, and we'll listen to him. So, yeah, it's a bit of a mess. And by the way, in case you aren't really familiar, one of the things that the Proud Boys have been kind of notorious for over the last, man, I don't know. Let's see. Here, let me pull up a little thing. Okay, I'm gonna pull up a thing. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? I need to type it in. Okay. So there have been multiple attacks on police officers. In fact, there's an entire Wikipedia page about it, the 2020 Boogaloo killings. Basically, there have been multiple attacks on police officers during the protests to try and incite additional violence at protests, in an effort to spark this race war that they think is imminent. So, for example, there was, let's see. Yeah. So it turns out, like, one of these Boogaloo boys using an assault rifle, shot and killed uniformed officers with a silenced assault rifle in an effort to start this race war. And the idea being, well, if I shoot these officers, it will be blamed on the protesters, and it will be called a riot, and we will then have an excuse to crack down on these protesters, who are overwhelmingly black, and it will start this race war. There is also an incident in, let's see, yeah, a drive-by shooting, and these are people who are more than willing to commit acts of violence. Like, they're sitting at home and they are just raring to go. They want to kill people. So when the FBI puts out this report very quietly during a presidential debate where they know it's not going to get a whole lot of coverage, man, I think I think that kind of shows you where their head's at. I think, I mean, it's been long known that there's a lot of white supremacists within law enforcement. There's ongoing efforts to infiltrate law enforcement with white supremacist agitators. And while these reports do get compiled, and it's heartening to see that this report even exists, to kind of an attempt to warn us about this danger, the fact that it gets released in such a way so as to downplay the threat, and there aren't like all kinds of alarm bells going off about what's going on here, is very, very deeply troubling. And I don't really have any advice other than if you have to, if you need to vote still, consider voting by mail. Especially if you live in an area where you think some of these people will show up. And if you really aren't trusting of the postal service to make sure that your ballot gets counted, you can fill out your absentee ballot and then show up at the polling place to just drop off your ballot. And that might be safer than like standing in a potential line when these guys show up. And the other bit of advice is look into your local gun laws, and if you feel like it's appropriate for you, it's not appropriate for everyone, but you might want to consider joining the Socialist Rifle Association. So that's that. I'm not a huge by the way, I'm not a huge proponent of like going out and buying guns, but I will make an exception for insane fascists, racists who want to incite race wars and intimidate voters and undermine democracy. So, that being said, good luck, everybody, and make sure you stay safe. Okay?